one of my favorite characters in the Bible. Now, some of you have Sarah, some of you have Rachel, some of you have Rebecca, some of you have Esther. I like Hagar. She's my favorite, and she makes the top 10 of the list. And, well, we'll share some of that as we go along. Hey, Hagar, happy Mother's Day. And she had a pretty good one, finally. We're going to look at chapters 16 and 21 in the book of Genesis. We will use chapter 16 for our starting point. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness by the spring on the way to Shur. He said to Hagar, Sarah's maid, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority." Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her further, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers." Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees," for she said, "Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. I like this particular passage, I like this particular character, because she reminds me of every mother who has a load to carry. I can remember one time years ago, there was a lady in our church. She was just a hairdresser, that's all. She had no big fortune or anything. She ended up being a single mother. She struggled for years. All of a sudden, after her children had grown up and they had little respect for her, she passed away suddenly. When we had the funeral, there were over 500 people from the community at that funeral. Her children were blown away. They didn't realize what kind of a mother they had. And what I want is for our people to know the kind of mother that they've had, particularly those who have had to work under an extra heavy burden. And we want to honor them. We want to honor those who hit the wall. They couldn't find the door. But having hit the wall, they found Jesus to be the door. And oftentimes it is in life. It is in the life of a struggling mother that we see the faithfulness of God. And we see this in the life of Hagar. Hagar the runaway and Hagar the castaway. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Now, before you start looking at this in terms of perhaps today's standards, keep in mind that this was a legal thing to do. We keep in mind that lineage meant much more than it does to many of us. We keep in mind that they wanted to be sure that they had a progeny. And so to make sure that they could keep the family line going, those who were wealthy enough could do this. They could go ahead and enter into a relationship, and any child born would belong to the husband, to the father. And in this instance, not to Hagar, but to Sarah. You say, well, Hagar was used. Yes, she was. She was Sarah's personal servant and no more. She had no control over the decisions regarding her life. But she probably agreed with the decision because it gave not her freedom, but it gave to her an elevated status. Now she was more than Sarah's maid. She was the surrogate mother, and this gave her standing. But she didn't handle it very well. He went into Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. This is a lady who lost track of who she is, who she was. She lost track of where her standing was in that family. She was filled with pride, with hubris, and she was filled with contempt for Sarah. And she definitely created an unacceptable situation. Now, for some of you who have known me for years, I'm sure you're saying, now we know why she's one of your favorites, Pastor, because she doesn't really do things straight. But the story is not over. Because she who was filled with hubris was also filled with humiliation. And Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. I always enjoy this particular passage because when things went wrong on her plan, look who got blamed. Husbands are good for something, and keep this in mind. We know this, don't we? When things go wrong, this is why you're here, hubby. It's your fault. You should have known better than to let me do that. We say this only with tongue in cheek, of course. But notice, it was very much an unrealistic situation and unacceptable. And it had to be corrected, and Sarah complained, and she complained to the head of the family. And Abraham agreed with her, for notice that he said to Sarah, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarah treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Notice that Abraham agreed that what Hagar was doing was wrong. And Hagar was abused and reduced to her former status, which in terms of ethics, probably not right. But something had to be done so far as Sarah was concerned. Something had to be done so far as Abraham was concerned. And so this being unacceptable to Hagar, she ran away. But this is where her rehabilitation begins. She was filled with hubris, which is not right. She was filled with pride and puffed up, and it was not right. She forgot who she was and what she was about. And then she was indeed humiliated. And that created the dilemma for her. But here's where we want to see what is really important. We want to see the faithfulness of God in the lives of people who aren't always as faithful as they ought to be. And Hagar is almost home. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Some say she had already crossed the line into Egypt. If not, she was close. Here is a runaway making her move across the desert, almost home, almost in Egypt. But the difficulty is this: she had no home to go to. She did not have a family. She certainly did not have a powerful family, because if she was an Egyptian, she would have never have been a slave. And if she goes back home, the likelihood is even her parents will not accept her because she is a runaway slave. And so we see that she is confronted by the angel of the Lord. Now the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Notice that she's confronted by the angel of the Lord, and we need to keep in mind that oftentimes prior to the birth of Jesus Christ, the angel of the Lord is no other than Jesus Christ, the pre-incarnate one. And he addresses her by name. How would you like to be a runaway? You're all alone, and now you're sitting down by a spring of water. You're figuring out perhaps what your next move is, and boom, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's somebody who calls you by name, who asks you, what are you all about? And all of a sudden, there's this need to tell the truth. He addresses her by name. He knows her status. Hagar, Sarah's maid. Where have you come from? Well, it's quite obvious if he knows who she is as Sarah's maid, he knows where she's come from. And she's smart enough to recognize this. And so she replies in all honesty. But notice that the angel of the Lord shows little sympathy, so it seems. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. But angel of the Lord, don't you know what is happening to me? Don't you know that I was being abused? Don't you know that I was subjected to all kinds of humiliation? I can't go back there. But notice, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. What you have done is not right, even if you have a case to make. And so for that reason, he makes a commitment to her. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. For those of you who keep track of the covenant made with Abraham, you will recognize that this is the language that the Lord used to tell Abraham that he is going to be the father of many people. And he's going to have so many kids that you can't even count them. They're more than the stars in the heaven and the sands on the seashore. And so he makes this promise. Go back to her, and I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count. Go back to her. Go back to that unacceptable situation, and you will find that under the terms of that unacceptable situation, you will find blessing. You will find fulfillment, because I have made this promise to you. And he gives this directive. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Notice the direction. She must name her son Ishmael, whose name means God hears. Now, for those of you who are really tied into last things and to the coming of the Lord and to what is happening to Israel, please keep this in mind. The sons of Ishmael, at least in part, are Arabs. And notice that the name of the head of the family is called Ishmael. God hears. Please keep in mind that there are more Muslims coming to Christ today than there are Israelites. Please keep in mind that whatever is going on between those two, the gospel still is the gospel. And that we need to understand that unbelief is unbelief, and salvation is presented to all people, and we don't care if they're Muslim or if they're Orthodox Jew. And let's be sure that when we are looking at our politics, that our politics don't screw up what the Scriptures have to say. Because Ishmael means God hears. And she must do this as a witness to the Lord's faithfulness. I'm making this promise to you because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. This is the promise that I'm making to you because I understand that what you have had to endure is not right. I understand that you have been abused, that you have been misused, and this is not right. and I am taking into account your affliction. And Hagar's rehabilitation is apparent. And now we are getting to why I like Hagar. Notice that in the 13th verse, then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?" Put the two together. Ishmael, God hears. I've talked with you and I've lived. God sees. And this is why I like Hagar. Because we are reminded on the things that she went through that there is a God who sees, who hears, who knows, who acts, who supports. And this is my favorite. This is why. She had met God face to face. She had survived the encounter, and she was blessed by the encounter. And notice that Hagar memorialized the place. She called it Be'er Laharoi. Therefore the well was called Be'er Laharoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. What does Be'er Laharoi mean? The living God stooped down to her. The living God looked up kindly upon her. He not only saw her, but he saw her through gracious eyes. And we need to see people ever and always through gracious eyes. And notice that Hagar's experience is also influential. For in the 15th verse, Hagar bore Abraham a son. And Abraham called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. She came back. She told the story. Abraham listened. And he listened to the slave girl, and when she gave birth to the boy, there was no question about it. Ishmael is his name because God has spoken to her, and God has seen her, God hears her, and God has dealt with her in her affliction. And it seems as though Sarah was accepting, at least on the surface. This is the picture of Hagar the runaway. She had a sense of what was right, what was wrong. She was not going to take it. But God said, go back. I'm the one who sees. I'm the one who hears. I am the one who's going to be with you. And my plan for you is far, far greater than running away to find your freedom. So what I find interesting here is Hagar the runaway goes back home and she becomes Hagar the castaway. And she again was devastated. Notice that Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. And in the 5th verse of Genesis 21, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. I think of becoming a father in my 70s. There's no way I want it when I'm 100. Unless God is going to show up to me and say, I see who you are, I see your situation, I hear your dilemma, and here's how I'm going to support you. Other than that, grandkids are fine. But what we are interested in is Hagar. For at least some 14 to 16 years, she had lived somewhat securely. She submitted herself to Sarah, she gave a son to Abraham, and she had seemingly been accepted back into the family. But Hagar's life soon was to be shattered. For the child, meaning Ishmael, meaning Isaac grew, and he was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Oh boy. Now we're back at square one once again. You see, by this time, Ishmael is 13 to 16 years old. And there was usually a pretty good party when the child had been weaned, probably between a year to 3 years old, because many children would die before they were weaned. And this was a milestone. And it was a milestone to be remembered. And so it was. But notice here is Ishmael mocking the baby. And Sarah then insisted that Hagar and Ishmael be driven out of the family. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Notice that Abraham was distressed and he was disagreeable. But really he had no legal standing, because in this situation, Ishmael, being the firstborn, had legal standing, and he could make the claim that the number one son has, and the number one son really had a lot given to him when the inheritance came to him. Sarah saw this. Sarah knew what the purpose of the birth being, but now the situation had changed, and so she pushed the matter to once again make sure that her son is going to be safe. But notice God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named." Poor Abraham. Sarah says, do this, he does it, and he gets blamed for it. Sarah says, do this a second time. Abraham says, I got blamed for it the first time. I'm not going to do anything now. No, I'm not doing this. But God intervened on her behalf. Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Therefore, whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. I am stepping in here. I am the one who met her at Beer Laharoi. She saw me. She heard me. I will take care of her. I will take care of these circumstances. And so on behalf of Sarah and in favor of his promise to Abraham, God steps in. And on behalf of Ishmael and in favor of his promise to Abraham as well as to Hagar. And the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. You have loved him. He was your firstborn, but he is not the son of the promise. He is not the son of the covenant. Isaac is the son of the covenant. But I will take care of Ishmael. He will be a nation. I will make a nation from him. And also to Hagar. Remember chapter 16, verse 10. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. The promise that was given to her some 10 to 13 years before is still the promise that is made. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand, and I will make a great nation of him. And Hagar once again despaired of life. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away, and she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. That always has seemed so stark to me. When Abraham moves from Ur of the Chaldee to Canaan, it's stated that he is a very wealthy man. He has gold. He has silver. He doesn't have to worry about the dollar. He's got livestock. He has got so much money that he can afford to have his own small army. And they were tough. And they would win. And to send out his maid, who was put into a position that she had no authority over, and do what needed to be done, regardless of her own hard ways. And to give her just a bare minimum. It seemed so harsh the first time I understood it. It seems harsh now. But what it does do, it lets everybody know that if this woman and her son survive, it's going to be by God's grace and his strength. And so she was ejected from the family. She was given her son, she was given meager supplies, she was summarily dismissed, and she wandered aimlessly because she was rejected by her family and seemingly rejected by God. Notice that above all else, she's back where she was more than a decade ago. But when the water in the skin was used up, She left the boy under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away, for she said, "Do not let me see the boy die." And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. The God who sees, the God who hears, evidently does not see me now, evidently does not hear my son cry. So I do not want to hear him cry either as he dies. This is the kind of mother that I'm talking about who is up against it. And this is the kind of mother who has hit the wall. There's no place to go. There's no one there to help. And she herself is helpless and hopeless. But God revealed his presence to her. God heard the lad crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What's the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." I love this. What's the matter with you? When you were growing up, did your parents ever say to you, "What's the matter with you"? I don't know what the matter is with me, but I know that they raised the question many times. And this seems so fatherly. This seems so much like family. He called to Hagar from heaven and he said to her, "What's the matter with you, Hagar?" And then, as a father would say, "Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." And what we are reminded of is the presence of God. He was there, but he needed to let himself be known. And he reminded her that he is the God who sees and he is the God who hears. And this is what we need to keep in mind for ourselves and for those who need encouragement. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?" And notice there is that mild rebuke. For God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, "What is the matter with you, Hagar?" The question is a good question, because God is faithful. He knows the conditions, he knows the situation. And notice the same is said here. God was with the lad, and he lived in the wilderness. I need to back up a bit. He heard the lad crying, and then notice what he said to her. "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Be the mother for a moment. Be in the desert for a moment. Be ready to die. Be ready for your son to die. Then hear a voice that says, "Go over and put your hand in the hand of this teenage boy who is dying, and stand him up and understand that he is going to be the source of a great nation." Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count." Did you forget that I said this? You need to remember that I don't lie, I don't make mistakes, and I am not insufficient. And so God proceeded to implement. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. He proceeded to implement the terms of his promise. He met the immediate needs. And he met the needs of Ishmael as well. Because what we see is the ongoing presence of God. He was with the lad, and the lad grew, and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an archer. And notice his last days. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. And they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt as one goes toward Assyria. He settled in defiance of all of his relatives. Everything that God said would happen did happen, because he was there. He was in it, and he was supporting Hagar. When Abraham died, Ishmael and Isaac were together for what would be the funeral service. In Ishmael's life, he was the father of 12 tribes, 12 princes, and he had a good life. And notice the same is true of Hagar. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. The land that she could not go to when she ran away, she could now go to because she was a free woman. And she had the wherewithal to go to Egypt. She had the authority to select a wife for her son. She lived as she wanted to live, a free woman, the mother of a son who indeed was blessed by God. I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong. And let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. The one thing that Hagar had to do was to wait for the Lord. After she hit the wall and there was nothing left to do, she had to wait for the Lord. And the Lord made provision, and the Lord made a promise, and the Lord kept that promise. And I think the challenge for you and for me and for all mothers is that we need to thank the Lord for those mothers who have made the journey. Maybe some of you in here had a mother who had to struggle like Hagar. Thank God for her. And we need to pray for those who walk in the shadows of despair. And we need to stand by them and help them when we can. And we need to encourage them to wait for the Lord. And when we are in difficult times, we need to be an example of waiting on the Lord, so that those who may be in situations that are more difficult than our own can see what it means to wait until they meet Be'er Laharoi, the God who sees me. Until they meet Ishmael, the God who hears, the God who listens. He who sees and he who listens knows me better than I know myself. He who sees and he who listens knows my circumstances better than I know them. He who sees and he who listens has made a promise. I will never leave you nor forsake you. May we be as faithful to God as he is to us. Thank you, Father, for once again bearing witness and testimony to your fidelity, to your faithfulness, to your commitment to us. May we rejoice and be glad that we have a God such as you, he who sees, he who hears, he who listens. May we find strength, comfort, peace in these things. In Christ's name we ask it. Amen.